Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to the Excellence in Financial Journalism Awards ceremony. It's an honor to be part of today's festivities. First off, congratulations to all of this year's winners. As was said, my name is Justin Baer. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. I have been a business reporter for nearly 24 years. I got my start at the Journal-Gazette in Fort Wayne, Indiana, before heading back east to have stints at Bloomberg News, the Financial Times, and for the last decade, the Journal. I've also served as a judge for the EFJ Book Awards for the past 4 years. I am appearing before you from a Super 8 motel in Daleville, Virginia, a small town about a mile from the Appalachian Trail, where my son and I are pushing forward on our annual week-long hike in the woods. I regret we didn't have the chance to gather in person this year, and I do look forward to the moment we can. But I will say this is not a bad place to deliver a virtual address. Yes, the hotel has been fine, very affordable, really talking about, of course, the time we've had in the woods. Anyway, I always look forward to the opportunity to read the book entries submitted in the EFJ Awards. They never fail to teach me a lot about the world and about my chosen career as a business and financial journalist. This year was a particularly deep and excellent crop of entries. They explored both the colorful economic history of Florida and the rise of social media. They offered readers a glimpse of the future and explained the potential behind the blockchain technology that underpins Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I often carry these stories with me long after I've finished reading them. They inform my own reporting and inspire me to dig deeper and to approach my work, no matter how little time and space I have, as if I were sharing the definitive account of the issue at hand. I often fall short of this lofty goal. Most of us do, at least at first, and we set out the next day to get closer to what that ultimate and complete truth is. The allure of our jobs as reporters, and what I believe keeps us pressing forward no matter what, is that there are always new and meaningful stories to write. It's fair to say that when all is said and done, there will be dozens, if not hundreds, of definitive accounts written about the events that unfolded in 2020. Some of those stories were written by business and financial journalists. This is true in part because some of last year's stories were so big and complicated that they forced newsrooms to really go in sort of a all hands on deck mode for most of the year. At the Journal, for instance, corporate reporters were sent to help interview doctors and nurses at the front lines of the pandemic. Stock market reporters were asked to cover protests across the country. As for me, I've covered finance and Wall Street for most of my 20 years, but in May, I was asked to join our Washington bureau to help explain why the economy proved so resilient in some communities during the downturn, and yet were so devastated in others. It was an eye-opening experience, and I returned to my old job in December as a better reporter. The business and financial reporters' contributions were not limited to these temporary assignments. As is often the case, our insights and understanding of money, powerful institutions, and markets intersected with events that matter to millions. I'm awestruck by and very proud of the work my peers across all new US newsrooms were able to produce, often under extremely difficult and in some cases even dangerous conditions. I just want to mention a few stories that really made an enduring impact. First off, the killing of George Floyd in May of last year was a tragic moment for our country. The shocking images of his death sparked protests against police brutality and systemic racism in more than 150 US cities. It also unleashed a reckoning that is still playing out more than a year later in nearly every public and private institution. Many companies, including news organizations, have been forced to confront flaws in their hiring and career development practices. Business reporters have helped expose these weaknesses to their readers, explain why they matter, and chronicle those businesses' attempts to improve. Second, 2020 also brought a US presidential election campaign often shaped and defined by social media platforms that for many have supplanted news organizations as a primary source of information. Long before the first signs of trouble would appear on Facebook posts everywhere, business reporters had helped sound the alarm on the sweeping power these platforms wielded over the way information is consumed, the dangers of disinformation, and the science behind the platform's algorithms. And finally, of course, there was the global coronavirus pandemic. The virus led to the deaths of more than 600,000 people in this country alone and uprooted the lives of millions more. It brought the economy to a standstill, and it transformed the way many of us work. I remember sitting in the New York newsroom in February of last year and watching as some of our US expats stopped by the mothership as they returned to the States. I considered then that this was probably playing out in thousands of offices across the country. It seemed inevitable then that Americans would soon confront this virus. Of course, I certainly had no idea that we would still be working almost exclusively remotely for more than a year later. Yet as the crisis circled the globe, its effects were far-reaching and shocking. In parts of the country, the pandemic triggered dangerous shortages in everything from masks to respirators to hospital beds. And of course, it led to the dramatic race for vaccines that would end it. The lockdowns imposed by state and local governments to help contain the virus's spread crippled industries, including countless small businesses dependent on shoppers, diners, and tourists, many of whom stayed home to ride out the crisis. Meantime, the global markets suddenly found themselves as they were during the depths of the financial crisis of 2008, frozen and incapable of serving their critical role as intermediaries between borrowers and lenders and buyers and sellers. Companies and local governments, for a time, dependent on these funding markets, worried that they wouldn't make payroll. An overwhelming response by the federal government had, as it did 12 years earlier, helped unclog the financial system. Fears over the virus's effects and over the economy subsided, eventually giving way to a stock market rally that inspired a new generation of investors to pick stocks. And with all of these seminal stories of last year, one thing rang true for me even more than any other time in my career. Journalism matters. Now, more than ever before, an unbiased truth that journalists deliver matters. In a time when facts are disputed and discounted, and disinformation campaigns seek to hijack our national discourse, truth matters. And perhaps what's most exciting for me personally is that business journalists played such a vital role on so many important stories. So much of what defines success in news, and probably in any field, is coming up big when it matters the most. Spotting these moments and then throwing everything you have at them to assure that you can deliver these meaningful stories to readers. These news organizations rose to this occasion, even as the economic downturn deepened the media industry's own struggles with its transition from print advertising. That transition has continued unabated. A Pew Research Center study revealed that more than 8 of every 10 adults say they get some or most of their news from their phone, computer, or tablet. Only 1/3 of those surveys said the same of print publications. And according to Pew, 1/3 of the nation's largest newspapers laid off staff in 2020. This was up from 24% in 2019. And 1 in 10 of those papers went through multiple rounds of layoffs last year. Among digital native outlets, 18% cut jobs. These are sobering numbers, especially when you consider that US newsrooms had already lost half of their employees in the past decade. The pandemic and its effects on the economy, of course, made things worse. According to Penelope Muse Abernathy, the Knight Chair in Journalism and Media Economics at the University of North Carolina, at least 30 newspapers closed or merged in April and May of last year alone. We are bleeding so many talented reporters and editors at a time when the need for their work has never been greater. This grim news will not come as a surprise to anyone joining me today. Rehashing it, though, does serve as a reminder of the importance that we must do all that we can to support good journalism. In other words, please pay for your news. The winning entries in this year's EFJ Awards are, of course, shining examples of good journalism. It is gratifying to see this work honored, and it's inspiring. So when I drive home to New Jersey on Sunday, after my son and I finish up our hike, I will be thinking about a lot of these award-winning stories. And at some point, though, my thoughts will return to the job at hand. I look at my schedule for the coming week, and I'll make a plan out for the stories I need to tackle. After all, it's only June, and many of this year's big stories are still there, hiding in plain sight, just waiting for us to find them. I want to thank the New York State Society of CPAs for inviting me to speak to you today and for allowing me to serve as a judge in the EFJ Awards. Congratulations again to this year's winners.